Hi, I'm Rachel Cleet. I'm the section head for city planning here in Knowlton School. And it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Jason Reece to you tonight. Jason Reece, as you likely know, is a new assistant professor in planning. And he comes to us with an extraordinary amount of research experience prior to becoming an assistant professor, which is not always the case when we hire new assistant professors. He spent the last 15 years working for the Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity here at Ohio State. And I think one of the reasons a lot of us get into the fields we do is because we care about justice, and we care about equity, and we care about the way the world looks. And we want the world to be a better place, right? And I always think about, how do you really make that happen? So do I make plans? Do I read stuff? Do I talk to people? Am I an activist? And what Jason's work does is he really thinks about how we make equity a part of what we do every day. For example, he spent time in his dissertation and while working at Kirwan, working nationally on policy with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on their Sustainable Communities Initiative, where he consulted with communities all over the country about how to integrate ideas and action around equity into their planning processes. So that when we have, for example, a transit-oriented development, we don't have automatic gentrification and displacement of poor populations. How do we think about it, and how do we really make that happen? So more recently, he's turned his attention to health. And I'm sure he'll talk a little bit tonight about what's going on locally in Columbus with our extraordinarily high rates of infant mortality, especially in our communities of color. And when you look at the way in which neighborhood influences the life outcomes and the health outcomes of people, this is where planning becomes involved in health. And I like to say that that nowadays in planning, we don't have the usual suspects. We don't have folks who are doing transportation calculations and thinking about land use, as you might think about where do things go in a city. This idea of social planning and the role of cities in maintaining the health of individuals and of communities is becoming really central in the planning field. And so I bring you Jason to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, very good. Well, good evening, and thank all of you for coming out, and I'm really excited to get to share some of my research with you tonight. My talk focuses on this relationship between planning and health, and as I'll go into tonight, this is not a new thing. In fact, health and public health in particular has had a relationship with planning and also the design fields for a very long time. But my focus tonight is really more attuned to kind of where my focus of work, where my work geographically tends to focus, which is in communities that are most marginalized. So these are our neighborhoods, urban or suburban or rural, that have seen lots of disinvestment. We see lots of poverty. We see patterns of segregation. And really trying to think about how we can improve those places, right? How we can improve those places so that we have a more just city, a more just region. And in the spirit of that, the field that I'm going to pull from today is really the subdiscipline of health equity in the context of public health, right? So really a parallel to how planners maybe think about the just city. Folks in public health are thinking about goals of health equity, right? How do we have fairness in terms of assuring that everybody has basically the opportunity to live a life to their fullest and to achieve a healthy life. So in going into this relationship between public health and city planning, I am going to pull from a CDC report or study done back in 2006, really great piece, going through the long history of planning and health, in particular public health, right? And it's a great article that points out the fact that both of these fields have similar goals, right? We have similar populations that we tend to look out for, particularly the most vulnerable communities. There's a bit of an advocacy lens to both fields. There may be differences in the way we approach our work and the models that we may use, but the similarities are more than the differences in many ways. So what I want to focus on tonight is the last statement in this quote up above, where they note that both fields have expanded their tools and perspectives in part because of the influence of the other. And this is what's always fascinating to me, is when you have two disciplines that actually make each other stronger by the unique perspectives that each can bring to pursuing the same work. And in the case of tonight's talk, thinking about how planners, those are doing equity planning, focusing on community development, and those folks in public health who are pursuing health equity can work together, right, and create that synergistic relationship where they're informing and strengthening each other's work, particularly for those communities that are most marginalized. So a brief history, I'll move this pointer out of the way, of this relationship between health and planning, and I can't do this justice because this relationship goes back for more than a century. A little interesting factoid that two of the original 7 founders of the American Public Health Association were actually urban designers, right? So particularly the relationship between design, the production of green space, and the role of that in supporting health in cities is something that has always been very important in terms of the public health field. But if we move ahead a few decades, we look at the progressive era, late 19th century, early 20th century, we see the sanitation reform efforts in our cities and in our tenement neighborhoods. We see some of the first housing reforms. And again, this is part of that catalytic combination of planning and public health working together. In the teens, 1920s, we start to see public health be lifted up as a primary justification by the planning profession for why we use zoning, right? Why we use zoning as our primary tool to manage land use. And the goal of using zoning is to protect this public safety and welfare. And public health has been presented as a real integral part of that, as a goal of our work. We would see a similar justification emerge in the 30s and 40s and up into the 50s with the urban renewal period. And as you see here, pretty nifty graphic from the 1930s from New York City, where we were, again, using public health to justify plans and planning efforts in, at that time, what were known as the slums, and in this case, to justify things like urban renewal and slum clearance. Now, in the public health field, we'd see in the 1950s up into the 1980s, there would be this time period that's known as the health planning era, and you start to see in public health aspects of city planning tools in some ways, particularly as you think about service delivery, transportation, how healthcare services are accessible to different folks. And so health in its way also kind of embraced some aspects of planning and thinking about healthcare service delivery during this time. More recently, and I'm sure this touches upon work by many folks in this room and interests that you have, starting in the 1990s and of course taking off for the last 20-some years, has been the emphasis on food security, food access, particularly healthy food access, and also active living. Can people get exercise? Can they move about freely? Can they be active in their own communities to support their health? So if you took a snapshot today of where these two fields tend to work together most, really you're thinking about, again, these issues of active living, food access, traditional issues like air and water quality. Also, things like brownfield remediation, right? Removing toxic environments from neighborhoods. And more recently, because of climate change, issues of hazard mitigation and disaster planning. And these are, again, these are all the byproducts of that catalytic relationship between these two fields. So what I want to do tonight is introduce you to some other concepts from the field of public health, particularly concepts related to supporting health equity, which I think are very innovative models and ideas to bring into our work as planners or community development practitioners, or folks just working on behalf of marginalized communities to improve our work. I think there's a case to be made that we're in another kind of catalytic point of learning where both fields could actually strengthen each other by incorporating some of these insights that have developed over the last 15 years. So the first thing I want to start with here is to really present to you kind of a bigger model of what I'm going to talk about tonight. Right? So we're going to go through a couple of these major themes of what comes out of some of the public health research and literature, particularly in respect to health equity. What I want to close on tonight is what this actually means for community development practice, right, and planning practice generally. What's the actual application of these ideas to the way we work? And I'm going to close with a case study of a project I've been involved with for several years that uses some of these concepts. So before we kind of dive into these new models and ideas, I wanted to dispel a myth, right? So generally speaking, and particularly when it comes to issues of health, we often adopt a model in which when we try to explain disparities, differences in health between two different groups, we often point to behaviors, right? They're not eating right, they need to exercise more, and maybe this comes from a very deficit-oriented model, right? And this is common in a lot of aspects of social policy in particular, where we blame bad behaviors, poor decision-making for a lot of negative health outcomes. Even from a more altruistic perspective, we may still take this lens into our work when we kind of adopt this behavioral perspective, but just make the assumption that, well, it's a behavioral deficit and we just need to do something so that they can perform this particular behavior which we know will improve their health outcomes, right? So we're going to teach people to cook. We're going to teach people about vegetables. We are going to build that brand new grocery store because that's going to solve the obesity crisis, right? Once they have access to those healthy foods, everything will be great. So what I want to suggest to you is not that behavior, when it comes to health, doesn't matter, because it does. But when we seek to understand health disparity, right, the differences between populations, behavior doesn't hold up as an adequate explanation. And I'm going to give you some very simple data points here just to illustrate this, but this is supported by a great deal of literature. Let's just take a quick snapshot here. This is from Columbus Public Health, the city's health agency, back in 2010, and they did this really interesting infographic, very simple, where they looked at disparities in disease outcomes for all these different disease types. And they're looking at the gap between the white population and the African American population, right? And so they use a stoplight symbology to display this, right? So green means little or no disparity. Yellow means, yes, there is some disparity there between these two groups. Red means, whoa, there is a tremendous disparity, maybe 200, 300, 400% difference in outcomes, right? So a couple of things to take away from this. One is that if you look across an entire disease spectrum at health disparities, particularly between the African American community and the white community in Columbus, the disparities are vast, right? And they're multifaceted. They cover all kinds of different disease outcomes. But let's look at the disparities in behaviors. Similar type of infographic, similar color scheme here, right? And what I want to emphasize to you is a lot more green when we look at risk factors and modifiable behavior, a lot more green, a little bit of yellow, not a whole lot of red, right? This is a very simplified graphic way of thinking about this, but in short, when you look at the severity of disparities in health outcomes, they in no way match up to the disparities that we see in behavioral differences between communities, right? So, a few other kind of quick examples of this, and this comes from research from Dr. Liu who was with the Health and Human Services Administration. So I was involved in the early stages of what became known as Celebrate One here in Columbus. And Celebrate One is focusing on a lot of different issues and a lot of great work. But just like a lot of these programs that are oriented towards supporting infant and maternal health, there's a focus on smoking cessation, right? So it's not good to smoke when you're pregnant. It's very true. There'll be a focus on expanding prenatal care. So, the health outcome is because you're just not getting services, right? And so if we provide those services, we can fix the health disparity. But what national data tells us, and more explicit research studies find, is that and I'll give you a concrete example here, for African American women who do not smoke in the first trimester, their infant mortality rates are considerably higher than the rates found for white women who do smoke. Right? So think about that. We're saying smoking is the problem, it's a bad behavior, we're going to fix this behavioral issue. Well, actually, it doesn't necessarily add up in terms of understanding that disparate outcome in terms of African American women and white women, in this case, talking about infant maternal health. We see similar data when it comes to access to prenatal care, right? And so you can try to change the behavior, it's not going to close the disparity gap. And what this speaks to is that these health disparities that we're dealing with are much deeper, and they're also driven by forces that maybe we're only starting to grasp and understand, right? And so if we're not just talking about behaviors, what are we talking about? And this is where the field of social determinants comes in, right? So social determinants of health are quite simply environmental, cultural, and socioeconomic factors that we know have a profound impact on health outcomes, right? This is not a pathogen that you're exposed to necessarily, but it's really about the environment and the context, the society in which you live, right? So what's interesting about the social determinants model is that it creates a lot of opportunity for public health in particular to think about issues that are outside the scope of traditional health intervention or health care. Things like planning, things like housing, things like transportation, et cetera, et cetera. The social determinants model is really important as well because what we find is that the traditional model in medicine, the biomedical model, is not as good at dealing with chronic diseases as a model of social determinants. And by chronic diseases, I'm talking about things like diabetes, right? Conditions that folks are going to be dealing with chronically throughout their lifetime, and they are often acquired maybe mid or even later in life, and they have very high health care expenses associated with them. In fact, the majority of expenditures that we make in our healthcare system are to treat chronic disease. And our healthcare system, economically, is not the most sustainable system in the world, right? So we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. In fact, you could cut our healthcare spending by almost 50%, and we would still have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. That's how much money we spend. Much of that expenditure is really dealing with chronic diseases. And if you think about the arguments of how or why we might want to do things differently while we spend the most money in the world in terms of our healthcare system, we have very suboptimal outcomes, right? We're not at the top of the list of health outcomes when we look at our peers internationally. And so this social determinants model presents us a new way that we can think about health, and a new way that we think about how health can actually intersect with other fields and disciplines to produce better environments, right? Create better conditions, and so that people can actually thrive and see healthier outcomes. Also embedded into this understanding of social determinants is a respect or an appreciation of the role of place, right? So geography is a powerful lens when we think about health. In fact, if we think about health inequity, we can very much map that, right? We can map out those disease outcomes, and there is a very clear and distinct geography of health inequity and health disparity across any of our communities. And what I might suggest to you is that when we think about the experience of place, it's really about being in an environment where many of these different social determinants are kind of systemically working together, right? And it can create a very challenging environment then to achieve optimal health. The good thing about this appreciation of place is that it speaks to what remedies we may want to enact, right? So if we're saying place is important, and we can identify places where all these different disease outcomes manifest in maybe a half dozen neighborhoods, right, in a city or a region, then we should have a place-based strategy to focus on those communities, right? So that's where that's the scale and scope of where our intervention can come into play. Well, doing place-based work is something planners are actually quite skilled at, right? This is the whole field of community development. We go into communities and we try to improve those environments in various ways. What we need to do more of is think about how we can improve those environments, and so that we are actually helping folks achieve optimal health. So I'll give some quick examples, and this is some analysis I was involved with a few years ago when I was working with the Franklin County Infant Mortality Task Force, which became Celebrate One. What we had done during this time period was to map out the occurrence of infant mortality in Columbus, right? And so this is the infant mortality hotspot map of Columbus. We have basically found about 8 neighborhoods that have around a quarter of all of our infant deaths occur in these 8 neighborhoods. About a third of all of our African American infant deaths in the entire county occur in these 8 neighborhoods. These neighborhoods have infant mortality rates that are on par with international rates that we would see in Latin America or Northern Africa, if we were looking for a comparison. And so if you think about the work of Celebrate One, it's about taking this information and then developing a strategy to work within those places and those neighborhoods to address social determinants, to deliver healthcare resources, and to work with those communities in terms of supporting better infant and maternal health. And that's really the strategy that was adopted during this time period. The other map I'll show you over here is a map of life expectancy. Right, so there are some similar patterns that you see in these 2 maps, right? Particularly the west side, Franklinton Hilltop, the south side, basically the east side, Milo Grogan, all the way up to Linden here. Areas with much lower life expectancies, right? These areas up in blue, this would be the northwest quadrant of the city. This would be the eastern area, Gahanna. Much higher health expectancy up in those places. We see a health expectancy gap between zip codes in Columbus that ranges anywhere from about 10 years to almost 20 years. So there's a geography to infant mortality. There's a geography to disparities in life expectancy. And I could inundate you with data for the next half hour if I needed to show you the same types of disparities when we look at diabetes, when we look at public safety, gun violence, when we look at substance abuse, when we look at Narcan usage for opiate addiction and overdose. And you would see the same geographic patterns again and again and again, right? And so if you're thinking about this from the perspective of we have a healthcare system that's incredibly expensive, we may not economically be able to sustain it. Most of that expense deals with chronic disease. Most of those chronic diseases, the sharpest disparities in those are found in a handful of neighborhoods in most major metropolitan areas, right? So this is grounds for thinking about doing things differently and doing very focused and intense work in those communities. And this is that great bridge then between community building work, community development work, and public health. So what is actually going on within these neighborhoods? Well, I could pull out, various kind of more detailed studies that would look at things like housing stability as a health stressor, right? Transportation barriers as a health stressor. maybe the influence and impact of blight in the built environment, broken windows, things of that nature. We have volumes of research on this, but I actually want to simplify that. And again, kind of pulling in the lens of public health in this context, and think about this through the experience of stress. Because really what we're talking about in these communities that we're really trying to negate is the role of chronic stress. Right? So chronic stress, and there's a great study on this if you want to check it out at the New England Journal of Medicine from 1998. Also a great documentary on this that we have actually in the Knowlton Library if you ever want to learn more about this stress effect issue. Stress has been found to be an extremely degrading element in terms of our psychological as well as our physiological health, right? And it's not all stress. So there are two types of stress. There's episodic stress, and then there's chronic stress. So what is episodic stress? I'll give you a quick personal example of this. I'm driving to Toledo. I'm on 75 in a world of construction trying to get to a talk that I'm going to give at the University of Toledo. My wife is 36 weeks pregnant, and this was my last trip. And we had worked this out that, if something happens, you got to call me, I'll figure out a way to turn around, I'll come back home, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm on the highway and I'm already, tense, right? And then I see that she calls. I can see her picture on my phone. My phone is outside of hand's reach on the other side of the car, which is actually a safe thing. And so at that point in time, I had intense episodic stress. Oh God, we're having a baby right now. I'm 2 hours away. I have no idea how I'm gonna get back in time. I gotta pick up this phone. I can't reach it. I'm in construction traffic on I-75. So I'm kind of trying to navigate to get off the road so that I can go over to the shoulder and try to grab the phone. So my body, my stress response system is activated in this circumstance, right? So my cardiovascular system is activated, right? Heart rate's up, pupils are dilated, sugar production is up. And this is what our bodies are designed to do. We have a stressful situation, our stress response kicks in, it helps us navigate that stressful situation, and then it diminishes, right? Now, chemically, one of the byproducts of this that we measure is known as the allostatic load, right? And so we talk about a person's allostatic load is basically the volume of kind of stress hormone that we can actually measure in that individual, right? So if you look at the normal cycle, and let's use my car example, I'm driving in the car, I see the thing with the phone's ringing, my allostatic load shoots to the roof, I pull over, I finally look at the phone, I realize it's not an emergency, and then it goes down, it starts to diminish, right? And it turns out she wanted me to go to the grocery store on the way home, which was a really bad timing, so it's interesting stuff. What's chronic stress? Chronic stress is your allostatic load goes up, and it never goes back down, right? So if you think about chronic stress, that's the type of stress that looks like this. I don't know how I'm gonna make the rent by the end of this week, and we might get evicted again, or maybe I can get out before the eviction happens, and I'll try to get out of here faster and try to find another place to live, but I don't have a truck, so I can't move any of our furniture, so we're not gonna have beds to take the kids over here. And then the kids have to walk to a school and go through gang territory, and I'm actually really worried about something happening to them when they make this walk every morning, right? And I'm delinquent on my water bill, they're talking about shutting off the heat. My trip to work is a horrible 2-hour commute because we don't have good public transit that enables me to reach my job that doesn't pay enough. It's all of these things going on simultaneously, right? And that is a stress system, basically, that becomes exhausted, right? And so all those physiological reactions that happen, they keep on happening, right? And it's the equivalent, I'll use the descriptive here of, you can imagine you're sitting in a car and it's parked in neutral and you put your foot down on the gas pedal for a few minutes. It's not really going to impact the engine of the car. But do that and put your foot down on the gas pedal in neutral for 2 days, right? Your engine is going to break. That's what happens to our bodies, right? So we have this intense stress response, that uptake in the cardiovascular system impairs our cardiovascular system, eventually leading to risks for heart disease, for example. It's going to mess up our metabolism, right? We may become more glucose intolerant, then upping our risk for things like obesity. Obviously, when you're under stress, physiologically, your metabolism slows down. So then you're not processing calories the same way, in addition to a lot of other kind of psychological issues that you're dealing with. Right. So in addition to chronic stress, another issue that we have realized through practice and working in some of our most marginalized communities is that we're also dealing with situations where there's an intense degree of trauma. Right? So what is trauma? So trauma is basically like a nuclear incident of stress, right? This is a very catastrophic and almost transformational incident which completely overwhelms your stress response system to the point of making or potentially making permanent changes to your psychological health as well as your physical health, right? So here we're not talking necessarily about stress from, I'm going to get evicted and I'm worrying about how to pay the bills and all these other life challenges I'm dealing with. We're talking about abuse. We're talking about having a close loved one be incarcerated. We're talking about being a victim of violence or fearing that a loved one will be a victim of violence. Right? So these are the intense issues that we have to deal with, and these are also a profound impact, or excuse me, these issues have a profound impact then on people's health in the long term. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that impact looks like when I get into our case study. Last piece of these kind of public health insights I want to speak to is what's known as the LifeCourse Perspective, right? So we've talked about social determinants, we've talked about the role of place, we've talked about the role of stress and trauma. Well, what we have learned through what's known as the LifeCourse model in public health, which emerged around maternal health in particular, that stress is not just something that can impair you within the immediate time period that you're dealing with it, right? So what the LifeCourse model suggests to us is that an accumulation of chronic stress over a lifetime can basically put you at much greater risk for negative health outcomes. The field of epigenetics has been exploring an intergenerational aspect of this, right? In particular, when we think about trauma, right? And so that the experience of trauma can actually cause genetic changes that basically make future generations more susceptible to some of these diseases, right? And so when we think then about social determinants and we think about all of these place-based factors, we can't just think about the now. We have to think about not only from an individual's perspective, what's gone on in their life course, but think about the community as a whole, right? Is this a community where we've seen historical trauma? And how does that impact the way this community operates today, the conditions within this community, and the way the community maybe interacts with folks doing planning work, with power structures, with institutions, et cetera. So a quick example of what this looks like and what this means in the context of planning work. This is some analysis I did for Cuyahoga County Public Health and the city of Cleveland about 2 years ago, and I'm still working with the county on some of this work. And they wanted to explore this issue of life course and trauma, but at a community scale. And they said, look, we have neighborhoods in Cleveland, just like the neighborhoods I showed you on the Columbus health maps. They are the epicenters of all these different diseases and challenges that we see. Help us understand what structurally happened to these neighborhoods. Are there trauma events that contributed historically to the trajectory of what happened to these communities? And so what I'm showing you here is some analysis of just one of these kind of community stressors that really is a community level trauma. The colored polygons underneath here, you see some yellows, blues, greens, reds. That is a modern interpretation of a redlining map for Cuyahoga County from 1940. Anybody not know what redlining is? I have to explain that. Okay, good. So that's the 1940 redlining map for Cuyahoga County. What's important to note is basically yellow and red areas. Those are the areas that were basically barred from lending as a result of redlining for many centuries after that. The polygons on top of that represent neighborhood infant mortality rates today in Cleveland, 70 years later, right? And what do we see? Well, our neighborhoods with very high rates of infant mortality were primarily where we see except for a few exceptions, most of these areas where we see infant mortality rates that are excessively high, those are neighborhoods that were redlined, right? And that's an incident of historical community trauma. Those are also neighborhoods, some of those neighborhoods underwent experience of urban renewal, right? Displacement occurred in those communities. Also a historical trauma that impacts that community over the long term. So some interesting data from this project. If you lived in a neighborhood in Cleveland that was redlined in 1940, your infant mortality rate today was 500% higher than a neighborhood that had received a green rating back in 1940, right? 500% higher. The life expectancy gap between neighborhoods that were redlined and not redlined was about 13 years. The highest incidences of lead poisoning were also in formerly redlined neighborhoods. So when we talk about trauma, this operates at a historical community scale. And this is something as planners, although we tend to have a very long-term vision in terms of thinking about the future, we don't do enough work looking backwards, right? And looking into communities and really understanding structurally kind of what's happened in that place and how that should inform what we do today. So this analysis eventually made its way into a plan known as Health Improvement Plan Cuyahoga. And so actually got this analysis included in there as they set health planning goals for the county, which is still going on there in Cuyahoga County. So what does this all mean for practice, right? A couple of really kind of easy points, right? The easy next steps from this or lessons for planning practice. What could be the role of the planner or the design professional working in one of these communities or the community development practitioner? You're really working to help de-escalate the stress within these environments. Very simple, right? Identify what those stressors are and work to alleviate that. Public transit system is broken. We need to figure out a better way of making that system function for people, right? That's a major stressor. Before you do that, though, you have to engage and talk to the community, because only the community can actually tell you what the stress experience of living in that place is like, right? So we have to be careful about jumping into this with a bunch of assumptions. The next step and application for practice is a really interesting model that's coming really out of the West Coast, but is starting to get picked up in other parts of the country, which is to take what we understand about trauma and apply it to our efforts at community development, to adopt a trauma-informed strategy of community development and community building, an approach that we embrace as an additional lens of the way we work in communities, right? We don't throw out everything we know about community development, but we add this additional lens that helps us think about how we engage with the community and what we can do with the community to foster more resiliency and to hopefully mediate some of the trauma issues that they're dealing with, right? And this is something actually planning is quite good at, right? We are good at thinking about issues like this at a community scale. And that's what, in those neighborhoods that are those health hotspots, that's what we need to do. So just some details about this model, and this emerged out of the San Francisco Bay Area, but now it's being practiced at the community development organizations in Pittsburgh, using it now. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has become quite enamored with it. This trauma-informed model really gets at the root of a lot of issues that undermines the ability to plan in neighborhoods that are extremely marginalized, right? Lack of trust, distrust of institutions, inability to envision the future, or at least from a community level, feeling so disempowered that you don't even want to participate in activities like this, right? Because you feel like they will have no effect, no influence. You feel like you have no agency over your own life, let alone your neighborhood. So what this model does, I'm going to give you some of just the basic premises of the model. One of the first steps is really what I started with, right? So the role of the community development practitioner is to help de-escalate stress. The role of the community development practitioner is also to try to foster resiliency. And there's particular ways you can foster resiliency, which we'll talk more about later. And then you're trying to build social capital, right? Because social capital, social connections within a neighborhood is really the antidote to trauma at a neighborhood scale, right? That's the medicine we really need to apply in this situation. And then just recognizing the impact of trauma in your interactions. You're having a hard time wanting to come out and do a charrette with you. It's not because they don't like you. It's not because they think planning is useless. It's because of the complexity of all the other issues they're dealing with in that community, right? It's because of the trauma that they're dealing with. And so you may want to approach that work differently. So from a very pragmatic perspective, what does this mean in the way we work with community? So the first premise here is do no harm, right? Let's be cautious when we step into communities so that we don't accidentally re-traumatize people through our actions, right? This is why we kind of in the community development world really lean against top-down solutions, right? Because we may actually accidentally re-traumatize folks who live within that space. It means practicing radical acceptance, right? That the gang member with the neck tattoos might actually be one of the best community organizers in that neighborhood. And we have to accept that and work with that individual, even if those are norms that we really don't understand. We have to work at actually empowering community members. And part of that empowerment is really about the beauty of planning, right? What are we trying to do with planning at a neighborhood scale? We're trying to help folks foresee a vision for their community that they can buy into and then implement that vision. That's an activity that can reinforce feelings of agency, feelings of having destiny over what happens in your own community. That's an activity that actually can build hope in people, right? If I can start to change things in my neighborhood, I can get some control over the chaos that's happening in this place. And that's the beauty of planning when it's done really well. It can be quite empowering. The final point of this is that as practitioners, we have to have reflective processes, right? Because we're trying to work within very complex systems, and sometimes we have unexpected outcomes, or because of our frame of reference, unless we are from that community and intimately aware of everything in that community, there will be issues or situations that we didn't anticipate. And so we must basically be very flexible in addressing those things. So I'll close with an example of an actual community building, community development program that I have been involved with for several years. Most recently as the evaluator of the program. This is the My Brother's Keeper program, now called the I Am My Brother's Keeper program, that my old institute runs with Columbus Urban League. I think I see Phil. Phil, are you back there? I saw you. Hey, Phil was actually one of the staff in this program. So he can share with you some of the experiences of working in this program. So this was a program that was really designed around many of the principles of trauma-informed community building. The program works with African American boys and their families, roughly ages 8 to about 15 or 16. It's been going on now for about 3 years. And we tend to work with some of the kids, and I don't like this term, but kids who are often labeled as very high risk in the community. The typical family that we would work with in this case has an income of around $15,000, $16,000 a year for a family of 2 or 3. So you can imagine there's some challenges there, a lot of housing instability, et cetera, et cetera. The program itself is quite interesting because as a practitioner, you get very few opportunities to design a program from scratch. And this is what happened in this particular scenario where the former director of Jobs and Family Services asked for assistance in doing that. So this pilot program was created, and we've been evaluating the outcomes of this program since that time. What I'm going to present to you today are the outcomes after the first 18 months, my first evaluation of the program. I want to note that this is a youth-oriented community building program. I'm not saying everybody doing community development needs to stop everything else they're doing and just work with youth. This is one part of a broader portfolio of community building and community development programs on the South Side, right? Housing's getting rehabbed on the South Side, affordable rental housing being stabilized on the South Side. We have lots of big institutional investments going on. We have private investment. This is just another piece. And when we talk about planning for people, that's really what we're trying to do with this program, right? So, why do community development programs focused on kids? It's because particularly when we look at kids who experience trauma incidences, the likelihood of poor health outcomes, as well as a host of other negative health outcomes, escalate dramatically. And so there's actually a scale known as the ACE scale, Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. It's a 1 to 10 measure. And generally, if you score 4 or more on the ACE exam, which measures all these different things, the likelihood of substance abuse in the future goes up about 400%. Likelihood of suicide goes up like 500%. Physically, we see higher rates of heart disease, risk of diabetes, obesity, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of most alarming for folks who score a 6 or more on an ACE exam through their childhood experiences, the research has shown that their life expectancy is about 20 years shorter than folks who do not have a diverse child. This is a very damaging thing, right? And so doing this youth-oriented work is really to help avoid kids dealing with additional trauma, but also foster resiliency so they have the ability to navigate their neighborhood and be empowered in their neighborhood. Also, when we talk about youth and we talk about socioeconomic challenges in Columbus in particular, youth are definitely struggling, particularly youth of color. The data here I'm showing you, and if you look at the bottom bar, that's the proportion of the youth population, kids under age of 18 in Columbus by race, that are at under 200% of the poverty level. That's the threshold to apply for most benefit programs. Right? So this is the folks who are officially poor and the folks who are on the brink of poverty. And again, if we look at African American and Latino kids, and this is back in 2000, this is 2014, about 4 out of 5 Latino and African American youth in this community are dealing with that level of economic insecurity. So we have a lot of work to do in this community in serving those kids. The program itself, what did we do? Well, adopting a lot of those principles that we embrace, a lot of family advocacy and assistance, a lot of community building activities, a lot of experiential learning activities, right? So we have kids at places like Bikes for All People, where they're working with that business owner to build bikes, they're learning mechanics, they're getting STEM education, they're working at a gym with somebody who was formerly incarcerated but has really turned his life around, right, to get better control over their physical body, right? And also as a way of dealing with stress. They're doing community planning activities, right? So they did healthy eating and active living mapping for their neighborhood. And again, this kind of social capital building activities, right? So how does this group as a whole build social capital with each other? And how do our partners in the neighborhoods kind of build social capital then with those families? And then finally, thinking about like how do you provide a safe space for youth in neighborhoods that are very chaotic? Both a physical space, which we have struggled with programmatically, it's getting better, but also then a space just conceptually where they feel like they can put their guard down in that environment, right? So some of the activities here, some photos, right? Some of our kids at Bikes for All People. This is a local establishment. We always tried, in kind of the spirit of asset-based development, we tried to lean on local assets in the neighborhood so that we're connecting these kids to those resources. And then talking about iterative processes, right? So one of the biggest shifts in the program was basically through an iterative process where we realized we were completely outmatched in terms of understanding the scope of violence that the kids were dealing with, right? We just did not have the skills, nor were we anticipating how much these kids were frightened, afraid, fearful in their own neighborhood, and for good reason. This is, the South Side is one of those neighborhoods where we have a lot of shootings, we have a lot of violence, we have some gang violence. This is a memorial that's been up for 18 months, close to where I live, near Miller Avenue, Kelton Avenue on the South Side. You know, these are markers of chaos in the neighborhood, right? And so the children live within this environment, and it has a very deep impact on them. Our intervention in this sense was to bring in this model of violence interruption, right, where we try to diffuse violent incidents of violence, and really worked with the Columbus Urban League to help facilitate that, folks who have more experience in dealing with that particular issue. So, as I wrap up, I'll talk about some of the outcomes here, right? So this program's been working. At least as far as our first evaluation, things are going well. The social emotional health of these kids have improved. When you run the numbers, right, we see increases in attendance at school. We see better academic outcomes. At least for the first 2 years, we had no negative law enforcement interactions, which is very important in this neighborhood in particular. When we compared them to peers, they outperformed their peers in many ways. When we spoke to parents about what the impact of the program was, they talked about their kids having more confidence, more optimism, more hope, right? That very important aspect of hope. And now one of the more exciting things we've been doing is working on our first cohort of what are known as junior shepherds. And this is one of those individuals sitting there with Senator Brown at an event for the program. And these are boys who've now kind of had several years in the program, are getting older, and they're being groomed as leaders, right? So this is all about that building social capital within that community. I'm going to close with just a very quick video, because I could tell you all kinds of great things about the program, but I'll just let some of these kids explain it to you. This lasts about a minute. And then we'll open it up for conversation.
It's like a home because, like when I'm at school, I have my downs because there's like people saying stuff about me, saying stuff to me. And like at school, I always gotta have a bad company about me. But like when I'm here, I feel safe.
Like most of the kids here are very respectful to the staff and to everyone else, like around them. Like they're not saying, "Oh, you're ugly," or being disrespectful to each other. They're keeping each other up and staying positive.
We make sure that we all have fun, but like we have a good time doing it. And then like next week we come back and we like get to talk about it, and we all get to say like, "Yeah, I got to do that too." We all just get that like experience. Well, when I'm here, I think like it's my family. Yeah.
All right. So, when I talk about kind of putting the people back in planning, these are just part of the portfolio of things we need to think about, particularly in working in communities that are most challenged, right? So how do we deal with trauma? How do we foster a sense of community? How do we give people agency and hope so that they can envision a better future for that place? I'd love to open it up for questions. Thank you all for your time tonight. And
I'm wondering what kind of research the Crowan Institute has done on policing and how that's affected communities of color in relation to crime, and whether there are planning measures that are related to that.
yeah, really amazing question. Kerwin, not as much. I've done some of that research. There is a significant body of research on the impact of policing. I will say in the evaluation of this program, one of the themes that came out of this is that for a lot of these kids, they fear the police, right? They fear police violence as much as they fear neighborhood violence. And that's the reality of their lives. I've had to present that information to law enforcement, and they didn't like it, but that was the reality of how they were perceiving the neighborhood. And I think that's a reality in a lot of places. There's at least a perception in many of these communities where folks feel unsafe. This is very problematic, right? Because this is a space with a lot of violence, right? And you actually need that stronger police-community relationship. But right now, it's just not there in a lot of neighborhoods. There is a class where we talk about this, CRP 3510, Murder by Design, so a little plug. So happy to have you in there sometime, or any of you. Great question. Other questions?
Class of 85 at CRP. It's been 30 plus years since I was here. One of the things that I have observed is that some of the work that had come out of Chicago,
Yeah.
Saul Malinsky,
Yeah, absolutely.
think about what happened with the work that was influential, at least on one young fellow, who then got into the public service area,
Right.
went to elected, and became, like most towns, pretty successful.
Yes.
Not an easy path,
Right.
but what is it going to take for us to start to focus again on the soft skills
Yeah.
that inform the practical application in bricks and mortar,
Absolutely.
but also get at the longer term vision of what do we want to do, how do we want to live together?
Yeah. Yeah. Phenomenal questions. I wish I had answers to all of those.
That's why we call it the question.
Yeah. So I will say, I'll share a personal struggle, right? So dealing with funders, talking about those soft skills, they get tense around that, right? Because they want very measurable outcomes. And even with this program, I was like, well, can you show you shifted their grades? Can you show you shifted this particular, very clear quantitative outcome? And we can say, well, we know that they're a lot more confident, right? We know that their base, their foundation to be more successful is a whole lot stronger. And we're never going to shift their grades if we don't do that. I think this applies to adults too. We talk about job development or economic development programs. Why do a lot of workforce programs fail? They don't address the soft skills, right? And so I would wholeheartedly agree with you. I think it needs to be a broader conversation with policymakers and funders in particular to at least bring a balance to respecting those outcomes, right? It's a really fantastic question. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a tricky question, Jason.
Uh-oh.
So, if I put on my social science hat
Yeah.
and I want to interpret the results and say I'm a skeptical donor,
Yeah.
and say, okay, most of the children who participated in this program demonstrated quantifiable improvements. I would ask, how were those individuals selected into this program?
Yeah.
And were you lucky to get the young boys who were more likely to respond to this treatment? The classic social science movie
Yeah.
would be to say we should experiment.
Right.
We should tell half the boys they can't participate and
Yeah.
measure their outcomes differently.
Right.
How do you play with that? And have you thought about ways that you could ethically
Right.
kind of
Yeah,
develop
absolutely.
a treatment control kind of
Yeah. So I'll talk about the technical methodological side first. Obviously, not doing a controlled experiment here. What we did do is a control group, kids who signed up for the program or for whatever reason dropped out, right? And so we had access to all their data. And so we could passively collect data on particularly their school outcomes, because they had already signed documents allowing us to access that. So that became kind of at least some sort of a control group that we could look at. And the boys in the program really did outperform them. In terms, right, yeah.
They dropped out for the same reason that they took track.
Yeah. Very, very possible, right? From the social science perspective, it's the same argument that we get with housing programs, right? So Gautreaux, the mobility program in Chicago, often gets disregarded, right? Because, well, these were highly motivated people that wanted to move to the suburbs of Chicago, so of course they did better. So I'm going to put my social justice hat on and say, who cares? Right? Give kids the opportunity to thrive. If we can get more of them able to take advantage of that, that's great. From a funding perspective, what I would question is that you're never really going to perfectly be able to model this as an experiment, right? And nor should you, right? When you think about this principle of do no harm, the last thing I'd want to do is to foster a sense of hope for someone and to say, no, actually, you're a control. We're not going to give you anything, right? And so ethically, I just couldn't see that happening. But I think there's urgency, right? We got to figure out ways to address these issues. That data, that's 4 out of 5 kids, right, in Franklin County, in the city of Columbus. Everything we know about child development tells us that a life in poverty and a life in a neighborhood that's in poverty during that time period is not good in terms of future economic outcomes, educational outcomes, right? What's that mean for our region's economy? And so I guess these are the arguments that I'd be making to these funders. Whether they listen or not, who knows? Yeah.
Because part of the problem is they're not just saying they believe you did better than no harm, they believe you did good. They've got to figure out whether they're going to spend their dollar on your good or somebody else.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And there's an argument made here. I mean, this is one, they wanted to see some cost-benefit analysis, right? And I said, well, how about this? So we have 50 kids in the program. For 2 years, we did not send anybody to juvenile detention. 1 year in juvenile detention is probably going to cost you north of $100,000 for one kid. One child, right? Not to mention all the secondary and long-term effects of that. We know when it comes to these ACEs, the outcomes are actually scientifically shown to be quite powerful, right? So we know kids that have lots of trauma, their school outcomes are going to be worse, their health outcomes are going to be worse. We got kids health care for the first time in a long time, right? Caught cases of pre-diabetes. Right? That's a big cost saver. And so I think you can build that argument, but as you said, there is not a clear-cut way of providing that answer. I'd also argue, and this is a bit of an aside, lately I've been feeling like this argument that I have to show cost-benefit for the lives of young kids is really about as neoliberal as I can stand, right? And I'm just like, these kids are doing better, and in many ways, they're deserving of this investment, right? As a society, we have some responsibility in their life outcomes. I will say that when this program was funded by FJS, the first question from a reporter after the public meeting where they announced the funding was, so you're spending $5,000 per child. How can you justify that investment? How many people think middle-class parents, wealthy parents spend $5,000 a year on their kid or more? Trust me, you spend a lot more on your kid, right? The rest of us have no problem justifying that investment when it's our own children. It's when it's kids who are not viewed as equal within our system. And to me, that raises a lot of red flags when we start looking at things through that lens.
Would it like